is that the world we are moving into is going to be very different from the world in the past. I hear a lot. I think there's now a consensus that the 1991 reforms that were brought about by Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, both these guys were very decisive, very clear. They had a pretty wide team. I was privileged to be one of them. And I think things went very well. At the time, it was controversial. People who didn't like it said, "I got it." But looking back, if you get away from the political controversies of today, I think the good thing about a democracy is there's always a controversy. If there isn't a controversy, it's not a democracy. So let's be clear about it. If you want to be a democracy, you should be able to say, what is the other point of view, or whatever it is you think you approve of. But I think looking back, people from different sides of the present political spectrum kind of agreed that 1991 was a major reform. And they always say, well, we need a similar reform today. The main point that I want to make is that that's not necessarily the right solution, because I think 1991 was a very simple problem. I mean, the rest of the world was fine. We were the ones that were mucked up. We were doing things that nobody else was doing, and all we had to do was jump all of that. That's difficult, but it's intellectually not very complex. Today, nobody knows what to do. I mean, I think that goes for the richest and most powerful country, and it goes to the rest of the world. So, what are the four things that are going to make life difficult? And I've actually listed six for India. One is clearly geopolitics, and I'll say a few things about that. Second is technology, and I'll say a few things about that. The third is climate change, say a few things on that. And the fourth is fiscal capacity to do what needs to be done. You know what? I think Raji said that moving from slogans to actual policies always involves some money. And that has to be fitted into whatever the fiscal constraints are. And there are two others which we need to think about, which I really knew. One of those is urbanization, but I'll come to that. And the last one is demographics. Now, as I said, I'm not going to provide a solution. I'm going to hopefully trigger some thinking. So let me, since these are six things and I have limited time, and they tell me you want some time for questions and answers. So let me say a few things about each. You know, geopolitics, I mean, earlier, geopolitics was very simple. It was bipolar world with the West and the South more or less led by the United States. And then you have Russia and the Communist bloc, which was not terribly integrated. And so trade, etc., took place in the first bloc. Over time, somewhere around 2000, a little before that, the Chinese decided that they were going to open up, and the United States actually decided to help them. And they decided to help them because they felt that this would make them less of a threat and less sort of an opposing group. China would not have been able to do what it did if they had not been helped by the United States to get into WTO markets and all that kind of thing. Incidentally, you mentioned engineering. It gave the impression that perhaps not having an engineer is good for the economy. This is not actually true because, 90% of Chinese decision makers are engineers. But 90% of ours, certainly not engineers, many of them don't even have degrees. So, on the whole, if you would ask me what would happen if 90% of the politicians in India, referring to both the center and the states, were engineers, you can be very sure the economy would go a lot better. The economists you will always get. The economists are like bees which sort of hang around wherever there's something. Don't worry about the economics. This change, the big change in geopolitics came about when the Chinese explicitly decided sometime in 2010 or so that look, we've now got out of the low income category, which they were like us, and we got into the middle income category. And we need to think ahead. We made a 20-year plan to basically equal the United States. Now remember, they have the ability to do that because they're not running a system where democracy introduces a million constraints every time. So now if you say to me, well, wouldn't it be good if we have that? I don't know. I mean, in the sense that lots and lots of people were suppressed in China, which they weren't that much in India. So whether I would like to spend my lifetime in that kind of a world, I'm not sure, or I am sure I wouldn't like to. So therefore, I think you have to make some concessions. But I think we should be doing better than we are. And that is the dysfunctionality of our politics. But the point is that they decided very early on that they were going to challenge the United States. They didn't just say, we want a higher rate of growth. They could have said that. And for a while they did that. But their objective became, we must become dominant. In other words, we will be militarily dominant, we will be technologically dominant, and we will also be an alternative system. Because they want to undermine the notion that liberal values and freedom and individual freedom are at all important. Because that is what the West was saying. Mind you, the United States is backing off liberal values, individual freedom itself. But the idea of a free society was very much that, and the Chinese were challenging that. And they were saying, look, we're going to show the world that if you, particularly the poorer countries, if you want to develop, you don't have to follow the American way, follow our way, it's better. And this required real long-term thinking. They spent a lot of time and energy upgrading their own technological capacity. We can come back to what that implies for us. And as a result, the Chinese relative power, economic and military, increased very substantially. So, there are many graphs that plot this out. Share of GDP, world GDP, and that kind of thing. Any of these graphs will show you that in the last 20 years or so, the following is roughly true. The share of the United States hasn't actually declined, but not very much, more or less flat. The share of Europe has gone down sharply. They're the ones who really lost out. The share of China has shot up, exceeding Europe now. And from the United States point of view, they were quite happy with Europe being a large GDP comparable to them because they didn't think there was a threat. But when the Chinese GDP became, it's not the same as the US, but became quite large. And since the Chinese are able to mobilize their resources much more than a democratic country can,